You're watching World Insight. Still to come on our program, I speak to former heads of states on global leadership and how cooperation can survive in the Trump era.
For the politicians, there was a need to address the difficulties.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The supreme quality of leadership is integrity. That is a quote coming from Dwight Eisenhower. Yet the meaning of it has long been the standard for leaders throughout history. At a time of geopolitical uncertainty, integrity for leadership, both on an individual basis and as a generation, has been put to the test. So how to characterize leadership with integrity? How important is it today? Recently, I sat down with a group of respected state and global leaders. Let's meet them. Dr. Miguel Rodríguez, former President of Costa Rica, who served as Secretary General of the Organization for American States earlier. Danilo Türk, former President of Slovenia, also former Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs with the United Nations. Last but not least, George Vassiliou, President of Cyprus earlier, also played an important role in bringing Cyprus into the EU. They did not hesitate to evaluate the quality of world leadership today. Let's take a look. Gentlemen, you've been playing instrumental role in your own country's politics and been shouldering your responsibility for your generation of leadership. What do you make of the current generation, Mr. President?
I admire the current leaders.
For real or to be polite?
No, for real, because they are living in a very difficult atmosphere.
What do you mean by difficult?
Because we have been losing some of our assurances, our certainties that we had in the past. We were so sure in the 90s. Democracy, globalization, international institutions, rules that will allow nations to come together and to converge in their goals in favor of progress and human development. And now we're living in a time in which people have lost faith in the elites, have lost faith in, even in facts, have lost faith for sure in democracy and globalization, in international institutions. So to lead today, I think is much more difficult.
But I'm afraid that, Mr. President, that's exactly the trap they are falling into, because it's an election trap. It's a popularity game, in a way.
This is correct, and that is why I'm saying I can sympathize with the difficulty they face, but I do not approve with everything they do. And I am very critical of what we see nowadays in the United States. The United States has moved from a kind of a core of international stability to a source of international instability. And that, I think, has created problems for many countries, for most of the world.
Is it the time to think about, oh, the good old days? President Vassiliou?
No, this is not the right thing to do, because it's an easy way to try to evade questions. Every period had its problems, and every period had to be, for the politicians, there was a need to address the difficulties.
What were the problems of your generation you are facing then?
Well, one of the problems of my generation was populism.
Same right now, right? Populism.
Well, it's even worse in some ways. What I want to point out, however, is that it is true that the times are different, that things are more difficult now, but at the same time, it is true to say that there is a lack of leadership in the world. For example, Mr. Kennedy was one of the present leaders, or Churchill, or things like that. It's not a question of comparing them like that, but there is no doubt that a lot of our current leaders, if you want to use the word leaders, the current holders of power, because leader and holder of power is not the same thing. A leader shows the way forward and makes sure that this way is implemented or tries to implement it. A holder of power is interested in keeping his job.
It's two different, very different things in nature.
Yes.
And it's for very different purposes, as you may know.
Exactly.
What is making a leader, Mr. President?
Well, I would like to explain that when I say I admire leaders. I don't admire followers. When I said I admire leaders, I admire the ones that, given these difficult circumstances, are able not to go with the emotion, with the sentiment, with the passion of the people, but to try to rationally show the way, try to show that we lose if we leave some of the constructions that have taken so many years to mankind to build.
But that's easier said than done, isn't it? Of course, we have admiration for that kind of people, but you know, you just think about your own political career.
But you know, it's better to lose a campaign trying to lead and to show the way than to win a campaign going against what you know has to be done for your country. Because at the end, the campaign, even if you lose it, shows a way, teaches a little, allows people to think a different way. So I'm not that sure that it's always winning is the best.
Also for you, Mr. President, you are trying to push your country into the EU at the time. It's not an easy discussion and negotiation, as we all know. So how did that happen? How you were trying to convince minds at home and also in Brussels that that should happen?
The funny thing is that at that time everybody was supportive of the idea of getting into the EU. But it was easy to say it and very much more difficult to implement it.
Yes.
However, the truth is that in order to get into the EU, we had to promise things that at the end we didn't implement 100%. Not me, but subsequently. But anyway, this is a story of the past. What is more important now is to realize that whether the current holders, prime ministers or presidents do their job well or not, or they say they do it well, but in practice they don't do it well, it's another story. The main thing that we have to address today is how do you deal with the major problems of the world, to start with the climate change, which we know is huge. Secondly, with the inequality. It is unacceptable as a human being to accept that 1% of the people of the United States should own what the rest 98% has. So the need to have policies that are more, they are taking care of these problems and they're facing them face to face and not answering them in a populist way.
The urgency, both of you mentioned, of pushing forward the right policies and make sure it will be implemented to the degree it should is a challenge. You know that very well, President Türk, because you also work as the Assistant Secretary General of the UN in terms of politics.
Yes.
This is extremely difficult these days, particularly, Mr. President.
Well, this is certainly more difficult now than it was when I was working at the United Nations, because then, some 15 years ago and more, we were able to see a platform which was common. And that was a big boost to the United Nations with the Millennium Development Goals, for example, with reforms that were taking place, and so on. But now we are facing a much more difficult situation, because that sense of common purpose has evaporated in the world. Now, President Vassiliou has very nicely defined the two key tasks for the world: stop global warming, reduce the levels of inequality. These are the two tasks. These are the tasks which will provide a test for leaders within countries and internationally.
But now we see people export tensions at home, overseas.
Yes.
To have substitute for the real solutions they need to have as leaders. Now, Mr. President, when you look at that, what would you say? You know, when you are facing difficulties, you have to quit or not come into the office anymore. But some of the active politicians these days, they are there not providing solutions, while at the same time creating problems by exporting tensions overseas without solving problems at home. So actually double the tensions, if I could use this mathematic way of thinking about it. Mr. President, what do you think will be the way for them to climb down from where they were or where they are and be able to think reasonably?
Well, I think it's something that will require perseverance, persistence on the part of everyone who thinks seriously about how to solve problems. We have to face the problems, to put in front of the people the solutions, to understand that our solutions are not necessarily the best ones because we don't have all the wisdom, that we have to interchange with the others in order to create a better solution than the one that we're proposing, but that we have to push for solutions that are serious, that really give the face to the problems. And I think that that's the only way. There is no magic on this. It's a gradual, persistent system of working toward making people realize what is good for them and convince them. And that takes time and takes a passion of working for the good of mankind and of being serious about it and to use the best knowledge that is available to present what are the best solutions.
In those days, it was easier to say, I want to solve this problem, but I have some time in front of me. By now, we are losing, we have no more time. The time is limited.
Let's focus on what's going on right now, particularly with the international institutions. What about that, Mr. President, since you worked for the UN for several years? Are they still reliable mechanism anymore? Without them, what can we rely on?
Well, I think they continue to be necessary, but what is needed is a mobilization of global civil society. That's something that I'm missing nowadays. I think that the social media have spoiled much of the situation because they kind of trivialize things. People have opinions about everything, and it's very chaotic, really. What is needed is an articulation of a global civil society which will put pressure on political leaders. That's what we need. The international institutions, on the other hand, are an instrument. They are not kind of living beings. They can be helpful as instruments provided that there is an appropriate energy invested in them. Now, of course, the things are complicated and they can be helped in various ways. Mobilization of civil society at the global level is not going to come easily. It is emerging, but it is not coming easily. What I see as an interesting additional push is creation of additional competing organizations. I think for that reason it was quite good that China developed its Shanghai Cooperation Organization and later Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because that relates to solving of problems and creating healthy competition to existing international institutions. I would like to see more of that because I believe that this sort of development helps mobilizing global civil society and defining the problems that we have with the necessary sense of priority. This is sadly lacking and has to be established.
Now we see a time of dramatic change. There, of course, are a lot of challenges, as we mentioned earlier, but there are also opportunities. At the time of geopolitical change, a lot of countries want to make sure there's going to be a new role for their own development and their new role for their own existence on the world map. How do you see this competition, in a way, that's going on right now? To what extent do you think competition can exist in good sense or in a friendly way, in a way that would push the world for the better? To what extent do you think competition already would become dangerous and would push us to way more geopolitical game?
Well, I think very briefly and very simply put, we live in a world where we need a simultaneous competition and cooperation. That's not easy to manage, but it is necessary to manage. We need to compete, but we need to cooperate at the same time. There are no natural allies anymore, and there are no forever friends, and there are no forever and natural enemies. We don't live in a world of enemies. We live in the world of competitors. We live in the world of competitors, and of course there are dangers also, but we shouldn't see the other as an enemy and friends as allies against somebody else. And that's the key to establishing competition within the framework of necessary cooperation.
We shouldn't, we can't, we'd better not, but that's the wish that we have. Well, the realities are not necessarily all that beautiful. Is it, Mr. President?
That there is the international organizations is a name. In reality, they are as efficient as the main powers within those organizations. For example, take WTO. You may complain of this or that, but at the same time, you must not forget that President Trump is trying to boycott the WTO. And that makes life much more difficult. And the same is valid also for other international organizations. Therefore, you cannot expect the solution of the problems, although I fully agree with what Mr. President Danilo said, that competition is important. Yeah, but to have competition, you must have persons that can really compete. It's not just that I am the greater power and I impose it, because at the end of the day, that imposition will turn against you.
Yeah. Imposing and bullying.
Well, I think that imposition is simply not going to succeed. We are now in a situation where we are overwhelmed by day after day by tweets, by policy moves, by acts which show the spirit of imposition. Now this, of course, can spoil, this can poison the international atmosphere to a certain extent, but I'm sure this is not going to succeed. This is not going to last forever. It is simply going to end at some point, and what is needed really is a combination of forces that would simply work as countervailing force. I see possibilities there, and when we talk about WTO, it's already important that China and the European Union cooperate on reform projects, that Japan can be brought into the picture as a cooperating partner for a better World Trade Organization.
I see.
So pressure has to move in that direction, and then obviously the politics of bullying and pressure is not going to succeed.
Do you agree, Mr. President?
Well, I think that one thing I would like to mention is that when I started saying that we are facing special problems today, I don't mind at all, I don't mean at all, that in the past we didn't have the problems. Living in society is difficult, organizing nations is difficult, having relations among nations is difficult. Humankind's history is full of problems and of wars, of mistakes, of failures. So that we shouldn't get pessimistic about this because we're living difficult times. Because we have lived, the humanity has lived worse times, many times. Today we have less wars in the world per capita than never in the history that has been able to be established. We have less people in poverty than never before. We have longer lasting lives all around. So we have a lot of progress. And this should be the basis to be optimist about the possibility of keep on improving. And I think that, that we need a little bit of humility. Very often we lose sight that we have limits. We don't know everything. We have time limits. We have resource limits. We have a lot of limits. And sometimes, if we just look at all that has to be done and the difficulties that are in front, we can become negative. And that's terrible.
What I want to point out here is that, yes, we have less poverty in the world, for example. But at the same time, let us look at why do we have less poverty. Because China and India and other countries in the Asian world have tried to improve and alleviate poverty. while other developed countries have increased the unequal distribution. So you cannot take things as generally world problems. You have to look at them as country problems, and then you have to see how you fight those problems.
It's such a pleasure, gentlemen, talking to you on some of the profound questions, actually, that are facing us every day. Before we go, what do you think the leadership should be about today? Just one sentence, if you can. Mr. President.
I think it has to be about truth, about facts, about realities, about values, and about really talking face to face to the people of what is the problems that we have and what are the best solutions.
I see. Mr. President.
I agree. Truth is in the core. The problem is that truth can be quite inconvenient. So leaders have to be capable of addressing inconvenient truth. And that, I think, is the critical question nowadays. In a pluralistic world in which we live, that's not easy, but we need a kind of movement of forces that would be able to confront the inconvenient truth of global warming and inequality.
I see. Last but not least, Mr. President.
Basically, I fully agree with what the two co-presidents. You have to say the truth about the situation, and you must have the guts and the courage to implement it irrespectively of the possible political cost, political in brackets.
It's such a pleasure talking to the words of wisdom and men of wisdom in this sense. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and also to demonstrate in history your leadership. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And we thank you for your kind leadership.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo you can see on our screen. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. I'm tuning in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Have a great weekend. Bye for now.